Alright, here we are on the trail. You can really hear that Camaro fan working. It's a powerful fan, but remember, you don't want to overdrive it. You can see we're going through this grill mesh, the transmission cooler, the AC condenser, then the radiator. Down here you can see the engine oil cooler. Let's take a quick look under the hood. Oh, and by the way, guys, that fan's really running high because I'm cooling off the drone with the AC. So let's turn the AC off a second so you can hear me. You're gonna hear this fan wind down now. So here it is. Here's a typical LT1 build. Same setup we've had for many years. Great setup. 8-speed transmission. You can tell this is an 8-speed transmission because the dipstick in the back. We don't run those on the 10-speed. We run them on the 6 and the 8. And we essentially don't run the 6-speeds on the LTs anymore either. We did some in the old days, but with the 8 and the 10-speed available, this is the way you want to go. So here we have a black Jeep in the desert on a really hot day, and it hit about 225 coming up this grade with the AC on. So that's not too bad for a new motor, and it's tight. I'm a proud American. So I'm not really sure about the specs on this Jeep, what suspension and all he's got. You can see that fan virtually turned off with the AC off. It really brought the coolant temp down quickly. So just imagine if that AC condenser was over 200 degrees. That's putting 200 degree temperature, or 200 psi. That's putting 200 degree air into that radiator. Now the fan's not off, it's still on, but you can barely hear it. And that's what you're going to notice with this Camaro fan most of the time, is you're not going to hear it. Only in extreme conditions like this, AC on, out in the desert, high altitude, and it's hot, you're going to hear that fan wind up. So let's continue on the trail. Hey guys, I'm back. Spent some time in Florida and Utah, and I'm back in Vegas now, and it's a hot one out there. We've been pushing like 115 to 120 degrees. We're in a heavy black JK out in these temps, so let's see how it goes. This JK has an LT1 with an 8-speed, which normally we're doing the 10 speeds, but you know, the 8-speed is an excellent transmission. It's one of my favorite. I know I had a rough start, but it really has evolved into a great transmission. The 8-speed is stronger than the 10-speed, at least the 10L80. The 8L90 is an extremely strong transmission. You can put it behind an LT4 or a pimped out LT1 and really have no worries. Big thing about these transmissions is you got to keep them cool. Now if you look here, I'm running at about 147, 150 degrees, let's say, and it's a hot day and we're going up the parkway, so that's not bad. We did discover on the transmission lines on the 8 and the 10 speeds that the earlier 8 speeds had a thermostat built into the transmission lines, and that would push the temperatures up. So now we're running the free-flowing trans lines on all of our 8 and 10 speed builds, and that really seems to help keep that temp down. Now this vehicle does not have the trans cooler on the rail, but it does have the oil cooler on the left rail, which most LT1s that we build do have. Let's talk a little bit about cooling. I know I have several videos on this, but let's revisit it, because some things have changed and some things haven't. What hasn't changed is proper setup, airflow. You got to make sure that you have good airflow through your engine compartment, and that consists of several variables. First, obviously, is the grill. You want to keep that grill clear. Now this Jeep has a screen mesh on it, which I'm not a big fan of. I'm not a big fan of installing inserts or louvers in the grill openings, or reduced size grill openings, or angry eyes grill openings. Now while those things may work in cooler temperatures, they do restrict airflow in the higher temps. So keep the grill open. As far as anything in front of the grill goes, that's pretty obvious. Whether you have a winch that's not sunk, a light bar, KC daylighters, whatever, keep them out from in front of the grill. Sink your winch down with the appropriate bumper. Run your lights outboard, but just don't block the grill. Now getting air into the grill is important, but getting the hot air out of the engine compartment is also very important. But before we discuss that, let me talk about a few other things in front of the radiator. The radiator's job really is a liquid to air cooler. So it has to take the hot antifreeze, and cool it to the appropriate temperatures. Now, in order to do that, it has to have cooler air coming in from the front. If you have the grill blocked with, let's say, a winch, then you have grill inserts, then you have, in most cases, a transmission cooler, that which is probably going to be running 150 to 200 degrees, putting hot air into the AC condenser, which is right in front of the radiator. The AC condenser runs at about 1 degree per PSI of pressure. So that's correlated 1-to-1. So if you get 200 PSI of AC condenser pressure, that's your high side, you got 200 degrees air going into the radiator. So now we finally get into the radiator with this hot air and weak airflow, and you can see the problem because the JK has a pretty small engine compartment. So we got to get the hot air out. Now, cold air hoods can help, but there's a lot of other things you can do to promote airflow. One is fender wells. The factory runs plastic fender wells that allow air to vent between the frame and the fender well, and that's really important. Back in the early days of the JK, I remember working with a lot of the suspension manufacturer companies that were making fender wells, and they were basically metal sheets or aluminum sheets that were sealed between the frame and the body, and they weren't letting hot air out. And I saw even on stock JKs, batteries melt and other plastic components melt, especially when guys ran headers, because these fender wells were not allowing hot air to get out. So over the years, the manufacturer of fender wells learned this, and I started to see them vent the fender wells with louvers or screens or whatever other means. Personally, I like to have the fender well off the frame so hot air can exit out there. And remember, you got your exhaust down there and a lot of other critical components, and you don't want to cook those. Let's go under the Jeep. Jeep runs a valance panel on top and bottom of the radiator to help airflow. Most of us take that lower valance panel off and throw it away because we're running a custom bumper or whatever. But you do need proper airflow around the powertrain. And one of the biggest offenders of that is skid plates. I know you guys like to run flat skids, and that's great. Just remember, if it's 110 out and you're running your Jeep hard, those temperatures between the skid plate and the body can reach 250 or even higher degrees. I've seen Atlas seals melt out, and not even on V8s, just on V6s with full flat skids. I've seen the seals melt out of the Atlases, and then all the oil comes out and the Atlas locks up. I've seen ARB lines melt and drip off the bottom of the vehicle. So what can you do? Well, preferably don't run a full skid unless you have to. And if you do have to run a full skid, try to vent it. A few vent holes here and there aren't going to kill it. You can also drop the skid down a half an inch or an inch. If you have to have the absolute best breakover angle and you don't want to drop the skid, then vent it. Early on, Jeep ran somewhat of a flat triangular skid plate, and they found that debris would go on top of the skid plate, and if it contacted the catalytic converter, there was a chance it could catch on fire. So they skeletonized the skid plate even further. And I know of some really serious JKs running around out there with basically stock skid plates. They don't have the full skid. Now, if you have to have the full skid, take some precautions. Wrap the exhaust with heat tape so that it puts out the least amount of heat into that cavity. Anything that's not protected, like brake lines or fuel lines, protect those with some thermal wrap. And of course, keep everything away from the exhaust manifold. And let's talk a little bit about the radiator. Unfortunately, in a JK, we don't have a whole lot of room for a radiator. I think it's about 22 inches wide. Compare that to like a Suburban or a Denali that has a huge radiator with huge fans. We've got basically a 19-inch fan in the JK with the SS setup. The stock radiator in the early JK was 17 inches. The 19-inch fan blade in both the Pentastar, the JL, and the SS fan can move more air at a lower RPM and just move more air overall. Now, it gets a little complicated on fan programming, so I'm going to have a whole video on that, because a lot of guys just crank up the fan parameter and think, oh, I'll put lights and winches and block the grill and just crank the fan up. But the reality is the fan can only do so much. And a big mistake is in the tune when guys crank up that fan percentage to try to compensate, the fan ends up shutting down. If you drive the fan too high, above about 90%, it goes into a diagnostic mode and it shuts down. So we get the call all the time, hey, my tuner just tuned it, and when I go out and drive it aggressively, the fan shuts down. And that's a very common thing, not just in our conversions, but even in the stock vehicles. Now, in my opinion, the best setup right now is our quad header radiator. We've got videos on it if you want to go out and watch it. But basically, we copied like a Caterpillar tractor radiator. The JK chassis flexes. It's body on frame. It's got rubber mounts, so the body's going to twist and flex. Aluminum radiators don't like to twist and flex, and that's why so many of these aftermarket radiators fail, because as the JK twists and flexes, the aluminum radiator is like a brick. It doesn't want to, so it cracks. It normally cracks at the tube to header joint. That's the weak point. You're going to see it start to sweat, then you're going to see it start to drip. So what we did is we added 2 extra headers. So now we got a quad header radiator. So the tube is now supported at 2 points on both ends. We also beefed up the tube so that it's thicker. We've seen our warranty rate on our older radiators, and I'm talking 4 or 5 years ago, go from very high to virtually non-existent. Most of the failures we see now are defects in production, like a pinhole in a weld. Every once in a while you might see a tube leaking, but it's more the exception. So along with a quad headed radiator, if you made it to a good, powerful variable speed fan like the Camaro SS fan, you got about the best setup you're going to get in this package. Now remember, the JK engine compartment is rather small, so we got to try to move all this hot air through the radiator, well actually through the grill, through the trans cooler. A lot of guys have power steering coolers, then the AC condenser, then the radiator, then out somewhere. So one of the solutions to that is to simply offboard some of this heat. And everyone's doing it now, including the JL. If you look at the JL, it's got an EGR cooler that's water cooled. It's got a tranny cooler up on top of the transmission that's water cooled. And what they're doing is they're taking the heat from these components, and rather than try to cram everything through the radiator and put more heat into the engine compartment, they're just putting it into the atmosphere. Now, being water cooled means that this hot coolant is going to go back through the cooling system, but the JL and the JT have upgraded cooling systems and some pretty powerful fans that deal with that. If you look at a lot of exotics and military vehicles, they offboard many coolers. Some of these exotics have 8-10 coolers all around the vehicle, some with their own fans and some without. Pretty much on every LT1 we run an engine oil cooler on the left rail, and that does shed a lot of the heat out of the engine. If you remember the old Porsches that were oil cooled, they weren't water cooled, so they used oil cooling to cool the engine, like the 911s, the 930s, and it worked well. Well, we're kind of doing the same thing. We run a radiant cooler on the left rail. I think we can go anywhere from 10 to about 24 inches, 25 inches. We run the biggest one we can. Some of you guys have side steps and interferences, but we try to get the biggest one in there we can. And what that does is it sheds a lot of the engine heat into the atmosphere rather than push it through the radiator. The same thing holds true with the transmission. Now, here we are in Red Rock. We've been driving for a while, and look, this transmission's holding 147 degrees, and it's pretty hot out there. So probably not going to need a transmission cooler on this one, and it doesn't have it, but it is an option. If you intend to drive your JK hard or in hot climates, just get the tranny cooler. What some guys don't understand with the fan programming is that transmission temp, air intake temp, and other factors combine into the final percentage output to that fan. So if your transmission hits 200 degrees, while it's not going to damage the transmission, it's going to drive the fan percentage up and up. And then you add that with the intake temp getting hot and the engine coolant temp getting hot, before you know it, you're past 90%, fan shuts down, you overheat. So you want to keep the transmission cool for a lot of reasons. 1, for fan control. 2, for the longevity of the transmission. The life expectancy of a transmission is pretty much directly related to transmission temperature. If you run it over 300 degrees just a couple of times, you're probably going to damage that transmission. And what we found is most transmission failures are directly related to heat and temperature when guys drive them hard. The early JKs, as you probably know, had a really wimpy transmission cooler behind the bumper. It was on the bottom of the AC condenser, and these transmissions would get so hot that the transmission fluid would spit out the dipstick tube onto the exhaust manifold and catch the JK on fire. If you ever see a JK with the windshield area burned up, that's probably what happened. So Chrysler reprogrammed the JK so that it had a hot oil warning, and you can't start it when the engine oil's hot. I know customers that were driving up to Mount Charleston that had to pull over a couple of times to let the transmission cool off. So make sure your transmission is running cool. That's very important for the longevity of your powertrain. Now, we talked about having a flat skid and building all that heat up in that cavity, and both the transmission and transfer case are subject to that. As mentioned, if you have an Atlas and you don't have unlocking hubs, when you go around turns, especially high-speed sweeping turns, the front drive shaft and rear drive shaft are operating at different speeds. So they're spinning up the gears in that Atlas like a whirling dervish. And they're building up heat because that's a thick gear loop. So you have the exhaust down there, you've sealed off airflow because you got a flat skid, you're building up all sorts of heat inside that transfer case, going around sweeping turns at 80 miles an hour, and before you know it, the rubber seals melt out and you lose your oil. So get proper ventilation through the engine compartment, on the under chassis. If you have to, and we've done this many a times, if you have to add an auxiliary cooler, like let's say for the transmission, you can put it in the back where the old muffler was, or even in front of the rear axle, and run a fan on it. We've got some LT4s and 5s where when you start the vehicle, those auxiliary coolers kick in. The LT5 has dual intercoolers, and you want to run an 8-speed with a heavy-duty cooler. So we got coolers all over the vehicle. If we tried to cram all of that through the radiator, it's just not going to work. And I think that's the biggest mistake guys make, is they buy the biggest radiator they can get, they put it in there, and then try to cram all this heat through it and crank the fan up. But at some point, there's a law of diminishing returns, and you're going to have to offboard that hot air somewhere else. All right, so I'm going to talk more about heat because this is really a big subject, especially now with the heat wave going across the country. And I'll be back with another video about that and some other stuff going on at the shop. So we'll see you next time.